Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. One of my favorite parts of doing historical research is when you're busy investigating one thing, suddenly you'll find some new information, some new breadcrumbs that lead you down a completely different rabbit hole. And that's what happened to me and was the inspiration for this episode. While researching something totally different, I randomly stumbled across a ghost story writing contest that was held in 1912 in a local paper in Pennsylvania, not far from Scranton for fans of The Office. The contest got a huge response from the readership, particularly given it was a fairly small paper. But two things really stood out to me. One, the quality of some of the stories. They were good, solid, creepy ghost stories. And the second, it's interesting to look back and see how regular people would write ghost stories around 100 years ago. Some parts of them are still very familiar to us today, while we see other tropes or other elements of the stories that have fallen a little more out of fashion. In today's episode, I will be sharing my favorite ghost stories from the Great Ghost Story Contest of 1912. But before we get to that, I want to invite you, if you live in Kingston, Ottawa, Toronto, or are going to be visiting any three of our cities, to come out and join us on a tour. There is no better way to experience the city than going around by lantern light and hearing a little bit of the history and some absolutely spine-tingling ghost stories. We have tours every night during the spring and into the summer, with plenty of options for you to choose from in each city. Information about all our tours can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. We'd also love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. And as for every podcast, it really is helpful to us when you leave great reviews, give us those 5 stars, and of course, recommend the show to friends. To set the stage, I'd like to read the original announcement that was in the newspaper. Write that ghost story you know and win a prize. Of course, you know some good ghost story, and of course, you can tell it if you sit down and try. Do it right now and capture one of the Poly Theatre prizes offered by the Times Leader. The story need not be something that actually happened to you, nor original. Any good story you've heard will do nicely, but give it source if you can. Don't hesitate because you may not be a quote-unquote expert writer. Just tell the yarn in your own way and it will be entirely satisfactory. These ghost stories contributed by our readers, or as many as possible, will be published in the Halloween edition of the Times Leader. For the best 5 ghost stories, the Times Leader will give 2 box seats at Poly's Theatre for either Hal Kane's great masterpiece, The Christian, to be played next week, or The Regeneration, to be played the week following. Write legibly and on one side of the paper only. Try and keep your ghost stories to no more than 350 words. Sit down right now and write your best ghost story. Forward as quickly as possible to the ghost editor at the Times Leader. Remember, the time is short. All stories must be in hand of the editor Wednesday, October 30th. Today, the population in this part of Pennsylvania is about 40,000 people. But for the contest, they received 1,200 entries, 1,200 ghost stories. And on the front page on Halloween, there's an entire column about it, where it says, the number of ghost stories submitted was far and above the wildest dreams of the ghost editor. In fact, that individual has been reading so many ghost stories that he's now going about on all 4s and feels so creepy. Due to the large number of submissions they received, they actually had to run ghost stories on 2 pages on Halloween Day itself and another page on November 1st. So just a tremendous response from people of that time. And I think sometimes from our bias living in the present day, with the interest in ghost investigation, ghost tours, horror movies, this kind of thing, we don't consider the significant role ghost stories played during this part of the early 1900s. In fact, many newspapers around that time would often run ghost stories as a form of entertainment. Now, I must admit, the ghost editor and I did not exactly see eye to eye on which were the best ghost stories, and of course that can be a byproduct of the time as well. But I've selected my favorites, the ones I think really stand up to the test of time, and we're going to share those with you right now. Miner's ghost warns of danger. When my father was a young man, he worked in the old Hollenbach mine on the mountain. Sometimes he worked on the night shift, and again on the day. The entrance to the mine was a slope, and the men were lowered in cars. One clear, moonlit night in January, as he stepped into the car to go down, another man got in silently and sat down beside him. Father looked at him and recognized him as a young fellow who had once boarded with him and also had been a laborer for 2 years, but who had since married, moved to a different neighborhood, and was working a tunnel of his own. "Good evening, Dennis," said my father. "It's a cure to sore eyes to see you again." The fellow answered never a word, but as father was lighting his pipe, he paid no attention to this fact at the time. When his pipe was lit, he turned to him again with the remark, "This your first night on this shift? I haven't noticed you on previous trips." Still, no answer, and looking at him closely, he saw that his face was ghastly as that of a corpse, and that on his forehead and chin were marks as though he had been cut or bruised, or some jagged instrument had been at him. "Well," thought father, "he's probably been in a scrap or something and doesn't feel like talking. I'll let him sulk away." When the car stopped and they both got out, he turned to his silent companion, looked him full in the face, and said, "Well, good night, Dennis. I never knew you to be sulky with me before. I hope hard work will bring back your good spirits before morning." And with that, he turned and walked down the gangway towards his tunnel. But still the man walked beside him, step for step, never uttering a word. At last, father, thinking, "I can stand this no longer, I will make him talk," turned to face him and saw not a soul. He looked back at the gangway, but could see no one disappearing that way. With the cold chills running up and down his back, he walked on towards his tunnel. When he met the fire boss, who accosted him with the remark, "Too bad about poor Dennis Mahone, isn't it?" "Why, what happened to Dennis Mahone? What happened to him?" "Didn't you hear?" said the fire boss. "He was killed instantly by a fall of coal at 10 o'clock this morning. He leaves a wife and 2 small children. They say her grief was pitiful when the body was brought home." "I feel sick," said my father. "I won't work tonight. Dennis boarded with me, was like a younger brother." With that, he retraced his steps and signaled to be hauled to the surface. He was hardly at the top when a fall of coal occurred in his tunnel, which would have buried him completely. Goblins even play baseball. It was the last half of the 9th inning, and the home team was at bat. The score stood 3-2 in favor of the visitors, and every man on the team was saying that he was going to go for it if he got a chance to step up to the plate once more. They wanted to make a good showing, as the season had just started and they'd finished way down at the bottom the former season. The first man up lifted a little pop fly into the hands of the waiting shortstop. The next man got to first on an error and immediately stole second on the first ball pitched. The third man to step to the plate sacrificed, and the home team had a good chance to tie the score. The fourth man on the list, by the way, was a youngster who had made a remarkable showing in the minors the season before, and this was his first showing as a pitcher in the big leagues. As he stood up from the bench to go to bat, a voice directly in front of his face said, "Sit down. You will never hit the ball." He looked around and asked, "Who said that?" His teammates looked at him and asked him, "Who said what?" He told them that they were kidding him and that one of them had said he couldn't hit the ball and to sit down. They laughed at him, but he felt nervous as he was feeling strange and worried about it, and when he went to bat, he struck out. That night, at the hotel, they were kidding him and said that whoever said that to him must have had the right dope all right. He smiled and said that probably it was his nervousness that made him think someone said it. After a little time, the players went to their rooms to retire. The new player, after getting into bed, lay there thinking about the day's game and after some time opened his eyes and saw something moving, to and fro, about a foot or so from the end of his bed. He rubbed his eyes and could barely distinguish what appeared to be a baseball flying around the room. He pinched himself to see if he was still awake, and still it was there. He determined to get up and see what it was. He did, and the object disappeared. After getting back to bed again, he smiled and thought his nerves were really on the rampage. But after a little while, he heard the same voice again that he had heard that afternoon, saying, "Sit down, you will never hit the ball." He sat straight up in the bed as the voice suddenly came from underneath it. He climbed out and could not find anything. Just as he started to get back into bed again, the voice said, "You will never get to sleep in this room." He was mad this time and puzzled, but went to bed nevertheless, and in about 5 minutes he opened his eyes again, and there sitting on a chair, on the far corner of his room, he could see what appeared to be a person in a long robe which shone with a faint phosphorus glow, very dim, and the voice saying, "This is the last. This is the last." The young fellow was getting scared by this time, and after holding his head for a little while, determined to make one jump and go for the door. He jumped, and as he did so, something soft brushed against his head. He didn't stop to see what it was, but opened the door. He could not see anything, but quickly dressed himself and went downstairs, where he saw a couple of his teammates who said they thought he was in bed by that time. He said he wasn't feeling well and thought he would rather sit up all night. The young fellow did not seem to be able to play ball for quite a while, and the team needed his services, and the manager tried hard to find out what the trouble was. One of the players thought it was time to make some kind of explanation and told the manager that the first baseman was a crackerjack of a ventriloquist, and they thought they would initiate the youngster. They had worked the ball in the bedroom by means of a string through the transom leading to the next room, under which was a dresser. After pulling the ball up, it would drop behind the dresser, and the ventriloquist would do his talking act through the transom. The ghost, which the man saw, was done by a little slide lamp which they had purchased for fun. When the young fellow heard about this, and thought how he had been done out of a night's sleep, and how nervous he had been, afterwards he was angry. But after a while, a little smile came to his face, and he said he thought it was a good joke, and everyone shook hands. This youngster started playing better afterwards, and the team eventually won the pennant. Ate a ghostly human hand. My grandfather, who is now living in Sugar Notch, tells of a terrible thing that happened to him one night in Scranton when he lived there many years ago. He was walking home from the Hampton mine at Hyde Park along a lonely road when he was suddenly overtaken by an old woman carrying a basket. Her head was covered, so he couldn't see her face, but she asked him if he didn't want company. Grandfather took the basket, carried it for her. She said there was pickled pig's feet in it, and asked him if he did not want some. Being hungry, he said yes, and the old woman took the basket and handed him a piece. Grandpa walked along with her, eating what she gave him as pig's feet, and the old woman walked silently by his side. After he had eaten for a long time, he noticed there was just as much left as there was when he started. He turned to ask the old woman about this weird thing when she suddenly vanished, as if she dropped into the ground. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and Grandpa became scared. When he got home, he was afraid to light the lamp, and he threw the supposed pig's feet on the table and hurried to bed. The next morning, he told Grandmother of the ghostly old woman and the pig's foot, which he threw on the table downstairs. Grandma said he must have been dreaming, and they went down to see if the pig's feet were still on the table. When Grandma picked it up, it was a human hand and showed plenty of the marks of Grandfather's teeth where he had been munching on it. Grandpa took it to the priest, and the hand was buried the next day in the unconsecrated plot in the Catholic cemetery in Scranton. When Grandma was alive, I often asked her if this tale of Grandpa's was true, and she always crossed herself and said it was. Please don't publish Grandpa's name, as he is afraid the men will laugh at him. As he is old now, I don't want anything to bother him. Ghosts wanted Halloween for themselves to enjoy. 2 young men left their hometown and started for the far west. After arriving at the designated town, they started in search of a boarding house. In one section of this town, they found an unoccupied house, so they went into the next house to inquire concerning this unoccupied dwelling, and the lady whom they met proved to be the owner. She told them that they might occupy a room that night, but what puzzled them greatly was that she would not take any payment. These young men went to bed that night and were soon sound asleep. Everything went well until the clock struck 12, at which uncanny hour a loud knocking was heard at the front door. Neither cared to open the door, but at last one braver than the other went downstairs and opened it. Not a person was in sight, so he started upstairs, very much frightened. They waited a while, but hearing nothing, convinced themselves it was a fancy, and decided to go to sleep again. Hardly had they closed their eyes when a loud hammering was heard at their bedroom door. Also could be heard all kinds of weird noises, such as harsh laughter, the falling of chains, and the moaning of people. Soon the door was thrown open, and the noise became louder, always advancing nearer to their room. They became so frightened that they even feared to whisper to each other. A white figure could be seen advancing to their bedside, and a bony hand was thrust before their frightened faces. The clinging garment being removed from this inhuman figure, a head could be seen, that of a skeleton, and a voice coming from this weird being told them to leave the house immediately, as the spirits were to celebrate Halloween and did not care to be interrupted by human beings. These young men never knew how they left that haunted house, but it may be said that they never entered it again. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. A big thank you to the people of Pennsylvania who in 1912 wrote some incredible ghost stories that can still give us chills 100 years later. And given the overwhelming response they got to their contest, I just want everyone out there to know I have an open door policy as far as ghost stories are concerned. If you ever want to try your hand at writing a fictional ghost story or writing up a real life ghost story, something that happened to yourself or your family members, I'd love to get them. I'd love to read those. And who knows, if we get enough coming in, perhaps we could do an entire show, maybe around Halloween, of listener-submitted ghost stories. Or maybe I could start including them in various episodes of the show. But my electronic door is always open. Please feel free to email me with your ghost stories. Or, of course, if you have show ideas or suggestions for guests I should interview, I'm always very, very thrilled and appreciative to get email from our listeners. And you can reach me at jim@hauntedwalk.com. Please rate and subscribe the show wherever you listen to us. And if you live in Kingston, Ottawa, Toronto, or are going to be visiting those cities, please check out our website, hauntedwalk.com. We have some great tours and paranormal experiences for you to check out. Special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our awesome audio editor, and Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all 3 at Haunted Walk. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.